today. Great pleasure for us to be here because this session is a joint session by IZW and the WWF Germany. As you have seen, the session is called Deformation, Species Functional Extinctions and Their Socio-Ecological Consequences. It's quite an unvoted theme, I think, and certainly in the heart of IZW and very much so in the heart of WWF Germany, where we work in all our project sites. I want to introduce you to two people who sit here, who are chairing this session. This young gentleman to the left is Andreas Wilting. He's a scientist at the IZW, based here in Berlin. And myself, my name is Stefan Siegler. I'm working for the Asia team of WWF Germany, where I'm a project coordinator for the Mekong region. Yeah, this session this morning we have three talks. We're starting with Professor Dr. John Farr, and then we have two presentations, scientific presentations, and then we have the coffee break. But first, let me introduce, and I'm really very glad that he's here today in Berlin. That's Professor Dr. John Farr, who is probably one of the, I would say, if not the leading experts when it comes to wildlife exploitation and bushmeat hunting. I personally, when I was a graduate, I think I was so inspired when I read his first papers, which he released in the 1990s. And ever since, I think a number of papers working on, say, dealing with bushmeat, exploitation of wildlife in tropical forests has really skyrocketed. But I think John really laid the foundation for the scientific, say, look at it. And we are really very glad that he's here. Well, John, actually, he started his first degree at the University of Wales, where he had an undergraduate degree in zoology. And then he went to the Oxford University, where at that time he met the director of the IZW, Professor Dr. Terry Hofer, and both of them, I think they did their PhDs there. And then after he finished his PhD, John went on to start his academic career. He went to Mexico, actually. So he worked for a couple of years at the Mexican National University. But then obviously he became homesick. So because he went back to his native place, he was born in Gibraltar. And then he worked in the government department in the environment section, where he a couple of positions there. But obviously after a while, well, we know Gibraltar is a very small place, so he decided, well, I want to see more. So he went to the Leibniz-Institut of Doral Wildlife Conservation Trust, where he fulfilled many positions. I think by the end he was sort of the leading scientist and really targeting and tailoring the bushmeat research programs. Currently, John is the professor of biodiversity and human development at the Manchester Metropolitan University. And obviously he's still not enough time, and he's also working for CIFOR in Bogor, Indonesia, where he is a senior associate of their bushmeat working group. So you see, he's quite a busy man, and obviously he still has some spare time, because he's also a visiting professor of the University of Malaga, and he even holds occasionally some course at the Imperial College in London. So obviously he's quite dedicated to this work, to this research work. Looking at his academic career is astonishing. He has over 200 peer-reviewed publications. He published 9 books in his name. And his research is not only Central Africa, he's also, because he's one of his mother languages is Spanish as well. I think he speaks Spanish and English, so he's using mother languages. So he works even in South America. Fairly recently, he just told me yesterday, he's also looking in bushmeat consumption patterns in Vietnam. You see, he's really a global player when it comes to bushmeat exploitation in the tropical world. So, what makes, I think, his research so special is he embraces a wide variety of biodiversity issues. Of course, deformation of tropical forests is a huge issue, but he also looks at food securities, where he works with the FAO on certain topics. He looks and works with indigenous people, and the impact of diseases. I remember a paper he released a couple of years on Ebola, when we had this outbreak in West Africa, in Guinea, and Sierra Leone, in Liberia. Yeah, he looks at the impact of diseases on wildlife and humans. So you see, he's really a cosmopolitan in terms of where he works, but also he has a huge array of difficult subjects which are all related to bushmeat. So it's a great pleasure once again that John joins this session here today, and we're all very eager to to your presentation now. So the floor is
Thank you very much.
yours. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to use, this is what they call the gelato mic. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me? Am I doing it right? Oh. Yes, thank you very much, Stefan, for the introduction. I do consider myself as a cosmopolitan person, and as a British person, I would like to say from here that I feel part of Europe. We won't go into politics, at least not yet. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to have been invited by Heribert and Marion, to attend this. And what I want to do today is actually give you an overview, a very broad overview of the whole issue of loss of biodiversity through overhunting, and how that impacts the functional ecology of rainforests in particular, but also on the food security of people. This, I believe, the whole issue of defaunation, let's call it that for the time being. We're going to be a bit more specific later on. But defaunation is the consequence of doing away with what's found in a particular area. I'll define it better later on. But I do think that defaunation, alongside deforestation, is one of the largest, the greatest impact, and the greatest threats on biodiversity there is worldwide. And from our point of view, it is not a question, I'm going to state my facts very clearly here, it is not a question of actually saying we don't want hunting, and we can discuss that later on in the panel discussion. What I want to say is that hunting should exist, but must exist on a sustainable basis. So I know that there is the whole issue of whether you hunt or not hunt, or whether you kill or not kill. It's a very controversial topic, it's a very emotional topic. My stand is that if you do things properly, of course, it is possible to actually ensure that biodiversity continues, and at the same time people are able to hunt for food. And essentially what we're talking about here is the hunting for food. And we know hunting is a global affair. We know that ever since, from about 10,000 years ago, we only started changing into eating more plant food, but essentially for millennia, for millions of years in fact, hominids and human beings have actually hunted for food. And it still happens. If you look at the actual distribution of caloric intake from carbohydrates, for example, we see very clearly that it declines as you go towards the pole. People are much more dependent on hunting and fishing as you move to areas where, of course, there are less plants. But in many parts of the world, hunting for food is still the most important way of actually feeding yourselves. And there are millions of people who do this. Reasons for hunting are varied, of course. You can hunt for trophies, and it's controversial. You can hunt for furs, you can hunt for feathers, you can hunt for many other things, but essentially most people hunt for food. Even here in Europe, when we actually have recreational hunters, to some extent, to a large extent in fact, a very large proportion of what they hunt is actually consumed either by their own families or given to somebody else. In some countries of Europe, as you know, it is illegal to sell sort of the game meat that you hunt. So essentially, hunting is still very much part of our genes, part of our DNA. It happens all over the world, and it is incredibly important within the tropics. And I'm going to define the tropics primarily sort of tropical rainforest areas, and we'll go into details over that later on. When we talk about bushmeat, or we talk about the meat that comes out of the animals, essentially bushmeat is a term that's better applied or better left in the context of Africa. And it's, you can trace it back to about the 1800s. a missionary in Liberia who came up with the idea that, you know, this meat that comes out of the bush, which is the forest areas, is very important for people. Nowadays, we tend to talk about wild meat. And the reason may be parochial, in the sense that my colleagues in South America, for example, believe that bushmeat is a term which is too African for them, and that we should have a broader terminology that actually encompasses, you know, what people are taking out of the forest for them to eat. So we use wild meat. All the documents that we produced recently in the Convention for Biological Diversity, for example, we tend to use the term wild meat. What do we mean by wild meat? Well, essentially there are many different animals that are consumed. The definition of wild meat may vary. Some people include fish, other people don't include fish. Some people include caterpillars, for example, others don't. But the fact of the matter, wild meat or bush meat has a huge array of many different species that are being consumed around the world. And as you can see from this table, it varies according to the area, of course, in relation to the biological diversity of those particular areas. There are less in Oceania, these are islands, more in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and to some extent, just as much in South America. So, a lot of species, lots of them, you know, quite vulnerable to extinction, but this is what is happening at the moment. Let me take some water. So, bushmeat is something that we need to understand. We need to understand because it affects so many different species, but also because it is fundamental for the well-being of many people living in tropical rainforests and other parts of the world, in fact. More than 50% of the protein intake of many communities worldwide actually comes from the meat of wild animals that they hunt. Moreover, it is of cultural significance. It's a cultural practice that many different communities throughout the world are actually still using, and therefore it has to be respected, it has to be used, of course, in a sustainable manner. And if you look at the issues related to why we are concerned about bushmeat, is because of its ecological impacts. Any overhunting, of course, will take animals out of the forest, and that will have an effect on the functional ecology of those forests themselves. We talk about food security and nutrition because many different peoples, as I've shown, are dependent on the protein, and not just the protein, actually. Meat contains micronutrients, zinc, etc., iron, which are fundamental for the well-being of the people consuming that meat. And of course, the issue of health and zoonotic diseases. Stephenson mentioned the work that we've done in Ebola, and Ebola is one of many different zoonotics that can actually come from dealing with animals. I'm not going to say actually consumption of bushmeat, but because the link is not quite there, but certainly contact with animals that you hunt can actually increase the propensity of humans to get diseases. When we talk about bushmeat issues, we're talking about ecological principles such as supply and demand. This is work that John Robinson and Liz Bennett did some years ago, but it shows you very clearly what we are dealing with. Essentially, we know what the supply of the different animals are. If you look at mammalian biomass, and incidentally, we are looking primarily at mammals because mammals make up between 60 and 90% of all the meat that's actually taken out of the tropical rainforest worldwide. If you look at the curve of supply, you will see that the maximum sustainable yield, the maximum amount of meat that will come out of a particular area is going to come out of the savanna areas because that's where the greatest mammalian biomass, standing mammalian biomass, is actually found. And this is because the primary productivity in terms of grasses actually promotes the large numbers of herds that you find in herds of animals, of ungulates in particular, that you find in savannas in Africa and so on. The actual productivity, or in terms of mammalian biomass that you find in tropical rainforests, the band which is in green there, is actually quite low in comparison to savanna areas. But when you look at the demand from Robinson's work and our work, you can show that the actual offtake is greater in tropical rainforest areas than in savanna areas, despite the fact that the latter does produce a lot more meat than tropical rainforests. So our concern has been very much that curve. And, we want to know what are the impacts of that offtake, that extraction, when production is actually lower than in other habitats throughout the world. In summary, this is what we think we know about the situation with regards to overexploitation of wildlife worldwide. We know that there have been population declines up to 90%, especially mammals we're talking about. We know that mammal meat, in particular in the tropics, from the work that we have done, and Robert Nassi and Nathalie van Beeld, is that about 5 to 10 million tons of wild mammal meat is actually extracted every year from the Congo Basin and from the Amazon Basin. The work that we're doing at the moment in the Amazon actually shows that, in fact, there's a lot more extraction from these areas, from the Amazon rainforest, than we thought there was. We always thought that the Congo Basin was actually far worse off than the Amazon Basin, but the data that we're getting now is actually showing that the situation may be not as bad, but certainly towards that situation. And 26% of mammals are threatened. So this is work from Ripple and others that actually shows that overhunting is a major threat to many species. Our concern has always been tropical rainforests. We have done quite a bit of work with Carlos Perez in particular, in which we compare the situation in the Congo Basin forest with the situation in the Amazon rainforest. And there's one simple thing. We were in a convention for biological diversity meeting, and I made the mistake of actually saying rainforests are the same, sort of. And of course, the Brazilians were very angry with me because they said our Brazilian rainforest is nothing like the Congo Basin forest. And indeed, they're not, of course, because they are different, and I'll show you the differences now in terms of hunting. But in general, it's a mass of green. This is terrible for me to say that in botanical gardens. But these masses of green are sort of the same, physiognomically the same. The trees up there, but no, of course it's not. And the fact that there are differences actually allows us to understand a little bit more the potential that these habitats have to sustain hunters throughout these green masses of For example, one of the things that's very clear is that when you compare the Amazon to the Congo Basin forest, you can see that the distribution of mammalian biomass, whether they are arboreal or terrestrial, is very different in both. In the Amazon, you have most of the biomass on trees, less on ground, whereas in the Congo Basin, it's the reverse. There are more animals on the ground and less on trees. When you look at the average size of mammals in the Congo Basin versus the Amazon Basin, you can see that the Congo Basin animals are generally bigger, and therefore it makes sense that they're much more on the ground, whereas in the Amazon Basin, they're much more on the trees and smaller. So this means that the hunters need to come up with strategies that are in relation to the distribution of mammalian biomass. For example, projectile hunting is much more a thing in the Amazon, and in fact Asia. I'm not going to talk about Asia now, but certainly blow guns, bows and arrows, etc. are much more common in general in the Amazon Basin than it is in the Congo Basin. In fact, in the Congo Basin, you develop, pygmies in certain parts of the Congo Basin have developed techniques such as netting, which is a collaborative way and a very efficient way of getting the animals on the ground. You can do that because there are many different species, large species of animals on the ground as opposed to Latin America. In the Amazon, you're going to get agouti, you're going to get paca, but generally you don't put out snares. You go like hunting at night if you want paca, or you go with your blowgun or bow and arrow. It's actually quite interesting because in the Congo Basin, pygmies have crossbows and bows and arrows, of course, but it is not, well, it's been used regularly, but snaring or netting is actually prevalent. What is interesting about the crossbows, as a little anecdote, is that pygmy groups actually observed the Portuguese when they came into the Congo Basin in the 1500s and so on, and actually copied their technique of the crossbow. That's exactly what they use. You look at a pygmy crossbow, it's essentially one of these old 1500 sort of crossbows that the Portuguese were using. But the fact of the matter is that in the Congo Basin forest, you can rely on putting snares a lot. You can rely to some extent on bows and arrows, etc. But essentially you're doing things on the ground. You're putting traps on the ground, you're putting nets on the ground, as opposed to what happens in the Amazon Basin. And this is a reflection of the distribution of the mammalian basin. The game is distributed in different ways, so therefore you adapt techniques to hunt that game in those ways that relate to that. If you look at the differences of the prey that are hunted in the Amazon Basin versus the Congo Basin, you see again a very interesting difference between both. In the Amazon Basin, in the neotropics, there's a very large number of species that are not taken. The small species are generally ignored, not ignored, but certainly not the main focus of hunters, but they will go for the larger prey. We're talking about woolly monkeys, we're talking about spider monkeys, we're talking about pacas, we're talking about tapir, which is the largest mammal in the Amazon Basin, 100 kilos. In the case of Africa, the distribution is very different. But basically, hunters in Africa, in the Congo Basin, tropical rainforest areas, we're dealing with a larger prey base. Basically, all of the animals above in black are actually taken, and only the smaller animals are, to some extent, ignored. They're children's food. Especially if you go out for small mice or small birds, that's exactly what children are going to go. But as a hunter, you have a wider range of species that you can go and get in the Congo Basin because the animals are generally larger. We say that larger body masses is typical of the Congo Basin, and that's what is reflected in the hunting of animals and mammals that you see there. Just as a brief, this is individual studies that have been done both in the Congo Basin and in the Amazon Basin. Although we are saying that the range of species that are being hunted in these areas may vary, if you look at this graph, you can see that very clearly, certainly in Africa, both for the pygmies and not pygmies, there's a great dependence on one particular group of animals. And these are the ungulates, the duikers, and Maria is going to talk about that later. In the case of the Amazon Basin, variety is greater in terms of animal hunting, but again, there is a certain dependence on certain groups. What I want to emphasize here is that even though you have a great menu of things that you can choose from, you generally go for certain types, which are often the most abundant. In the case of duikers in Africa, ungulates, these are the most abundant animals that you can hunt in the forest in Africa. And we've got to look at things in a very different way as well. Not from the ecological point of view, not why we hunt and why this is possible within certain types of forests, but also the idea that this is actually generating a tremendous amount of money, both in the Amazon as well as in the Congo Basin. But we have some figures from the Congo Basin from Guillaume Lescuyer, and that gives you an idea of how many millions of euros per year are actually moving because of the amount of meat that's traded in different parts of the Congo Basin area. And I want to emphasize that this is a crucial point, the fact that livelihoods depend on the trade of wild meat, but I also want to stress, and we'll see that later again, that it is the overconsumption of wild meat and the marketing and trade of wild meat that is actually causing the current problems in places like the Congo Basin forests, certainly in the Amazon now, and most certainly in Asia, in Asian forests as well. So it's not, let me just start by saying, it's not necessarily that these rural communities, indigenous communities, are over-exploiting. It is the fact that this element of the bushmeat question is the main concern that we have at the moment. The fact that people are are increasingly selling meat to big urban areas, and that is causing a flow of animals, dead animals, from the tropical rainforest areas into commercial points within big cities, even small towns as well. Let me just emphasize the situation in Africa a little bit. I'm going to go into a little more detail about what's happening in Africa. And if you look at variety of animals, we've said that there's a huge plethora of animals that are being consumed in both areas and all that. But if you look at the numbers of species being recorded as hunted, we're dealing with about 18 different species of ungulates, about 12 rodents, 22 primates, pangolins, hyraxes, carnivores, elephants, and lark. Basically, frankly, everything that moves in a forest is actual prey, can be prey to hunters, to hunt for food. You can actually hunt for food for your own family, or you can trade a little bit, or you can trade a lot to sell to city markets. And that is the issue that I said. Let's have a look at what happens in a forest when a hunter comes in. This is fairly pristine. There's, the animals happily doing what they do. And suddenly a hunter comes in. Well, that's fine. The paths are laid out. And within each of these paths, you set snares. And in fact, you're going to set as many snares as you remember where they are. Because one of the main issues of setting snares is that you need to remember where you put them so that the animals in those snares, when they get caught, are not wasted when you come back to them. So the number of snares actually varies, of course, between areas. But you can have 100, 200, 300, quite a large number of these snares were actually set so that you can catch as many animals as possible. And the good thing that you have about snares is the fact that it's very much an indiscriminate way of actually trapping. Anything can come in within reason, of course. Elephants are not going to fall into snares, but I've seen elephant trunks being caught in snares. So everything, and usually middle-range animals are the ones that actually get trapped in snares, and if you put as many as you do, you're going to get quite a good return for very little effort. And as you move along, you get pythons, you will get monitor lizards, or you will pick up tortoises, turtles, as you move along. But as you also move along, if you have a gun, you're going to start shooting as many animals as possible as you go and pick up the snares. So the consequence of this, according to John Robinson, this is wildlife strip mining. When somebody goes into an area, I'm talking about professional commercial hunters, when they go into an area, this area from being pristine, within a few months, and we have data to show that, you will have a decline in numbers of animals hunted and available because of the intense pressure of that hunting technique. And you may say, well, we've just said that Africa has a lot more animals, and the mammalian biomass in Africa is distributed differently, and there are many, many more animals in Africa than the Amazon. Indeed, when you compare the amount, or rather the kilograms per kilometer square of mammalian biomass in Congo Basin forest to the Amazon rainforest, you will see that in the Congo Basin forest, it's about twice the amount, the number, that the volume of mammalian biomass that you find in the Amazon. This study done by Lee White in '94, actually one of the few studies that actually looks at every single mammal found in an area, this is from Lope, actually tells us that some areas have about 1,000 and something kilograms per kilometer square. Other areas, when you include elephant, can go up to about 6,000 kilograms per kilometer square. Compare that to the mammalian biomass in savannas. Savannas can go up to 12,000 kilograms per kilometer square. So, you know, we said before that although it looks very rich, in terms of actual volume of meat available in these forests, it's not really that great. And what happens is that whenever you have hunter coming in, they will go for the larger animals, because the larger animals are easier to see. The returns for a bullet and so on is greater. So in no time at all, you can actually diminish the biomass found in a forest such as this one by about 80%, because 80% of biomass is actually sequestered by the large bodied animals. The story here is that depletion or defaunation is something that happens differentially. It's going to happen quicker on larger animals than in smaller animals, primarily because larger animals take longer to reproduce less, and so on. So even though we think we have a lot in these forests, it's very easily depleted, because the large animals are the first ones to disappear because of their lower reproductive rates. Ensnaring is a huge, huge problem in the African rainforest. You can see this is a study done by Noel Kumfeld some years ago, but it shows you very briefly that the number of carcasses caught with leg snares is 5,000, close to 6,000, whereas by gun is 600 and 274 for leg snares. So leg snares are a major, major issue, not just in Africa, of course in Asia, but this is what is happening in that. So if we have this process occurring throughout the rainforest in Africa, and certainly elsewhere, what we're going to find is a situation of defaunation. Defaunation is a term that was conjured up by Rodolfo Dirso in Mexico some years back, and it's basically a process in an ecosystem in which the top predators and herbivores are declining because of human actions. Defaunation we tend to use more specifically to deal with the loss of animals that have a particular influence in the functional ecology of the rainforest in which they're in, or the forest in which they're in. But, of course, defaunation, I think, to some extent can be applied to any single animal that's overexploited. Think of the passenger pigeon in the United States. Billions upon billions of birds. We thought they would never end. And in fact, Lewis and Clark used to find these birds blocking the sun for hours and days even. They disappeared. The last one was in Cincinnati many years later. So we can't be complacent about the fact that, you know, we can talk about defaunation in an ecological sense, like this, top predators and herbivores and all that, but anything that exceeds the production of a particular group of animals or species, you're going to find that these species will disappear in due course, sometimes very quickly. And we have evidence from, you know, the fossil record, etc., that body size of mammals, larger animals, have disappeared already. If you look at the Pleistocene extinct animals, if you look at birds, large birds, the moas in New Zealand, the elephant birds in Madagascar, etc., etc., we have examples that large animals have disappeared because they have not been able to maintain a pace of reproduction to do with the hunting levels that have been on them. And we can see that this is an effect that can be more or less seen replicated in other groups. And according to Ripple's work, you can see that there's a very large number of animals that are threatened with overhunting. 301 species from different groups, but some groups more than others, are actually now threatened by overhunting. And evidence of depletion, sometimes, I remember being in a meeting with the Secretary of Development in the UK, and she was telling us, you know, how can you say that all this is happening? Where can you actually give me evidence that species are becoming extinct, going extinct because of overhunting? I think they called us bunny huggers. There's a colleague of mine who was in the meeting, in the Antwerp meeting in London, when I was talking about this. And instead of me saying bunny huggers, I said honey buggers. So I was very embarrassed. But the fact of the matter is that we still are facing a certain level of skepticism that, you know, all the data or the information that I've shown you actually tells you what could go wrong if you carry on doing what we're doing. So where is the evidence that depletion may be happening? And I think there are, you know, unfortunately, there's more and more evidence accumulating that's actually telling us that species, especially large-bodied species, are disappearing faster or will disappear in due course if we don't do something about it. If we look at, for example, this graph, this is a very simple study that we did in Bioko Island some years back. Within a period of 4 to 5 years, we saw a complete shift in the size of animals that were coming to the market. And let me tell you, Maria will tell you more about Bioko, but essentially Bioko is an island, and therefore most of the meat that gets hunted, most of the animals that get hunted within the island, tend to end up in the Malabo market, which is in the capital of Equatorial Guinea. So therefore we had the possibility of actually seeing what was happening over time, and what we saw was that the complete drop in large-bodied species appearing in the market. As a reflection, we think of a certain impact of overhunting in these areas. And there are studies, for example, Carlos Perez's study in Latin America, which are absolutely brilliant, actually shows you very clearly that there is that tendency for certain animals to disappear if overhunted, or certainly not be as abundant. And I'll show you another graph that shows very clearly that the effects of hunting in these areas is quite prominent. If you look at that graph, this is the graph of heavy hunting. Basically, the larger animals have gone down. If you look at an unhunted area, the profile is completely different. And this is what the signals that we are getting from different marks. This is a rather nice study done by Benitez Lopez et al. In Science, and that shows very clearly also that there is a greater effect, there is a depletion effect in areas close to where the hunters are. Hunters are central place foragers, so anything around their particular settlements or hunting areas are going to be heavily impacted by hunting. This is what we call hunting halos around settlements. So there is evidence from various places, and you know, for example, if we look at the lambda, the possibility of a species has intrinsic rate of population increase, we can see that it's differential. You know, if you have areas of higher population density and therefore more hunting, those larger animals are going to be more heavily impacted than smaller animals. If you look at the difference between a tapir and a agouti, that's very clear from a large number of studies done in the Amazon basin. We tried to do something very similar to that by looking at extraction and production rates. Very much a mass balance equation sort of work. And we saw that if you look at animals, and each one of these are animals, mammals, in the Amazon basin and in the Congo basin, what you see is that if you had an equal amount of extraction and production, the species would fall on that particular line, on this particular line. If you aimed for a 20% extraction, which is theoretically a sustainable rate, you would have animals fitting that line. The fact of the matter is that most of the Amazonian species, according to that particular work when we did it, are below the line, the 20% extraction line, but a very large number, 20 species of African mammals, are above the overexploited line. So what we are saying is that even though we have no evidence, luckily to some extent, that the species are gone extinct, we have ancillary evidence that actually tells us that the situation is getting worse. And if you look at how the distribution of overhunting or hunting pressure is in areas such as the Amazon or the Congo Basin, this is work that we did with Stefan Ziegler, and you can see that there are very few areas in both the Amazon Basin as well as the Congo Basin that are not touched by man, that are not heavily exploited by human beings. So we have to be concerned. This is a wonderful set of slides that Carlos has lent me, Carlos Perez has lent me, and they very clearly illustrate what happened when you have mass of hunters coming into areas which are relatively intact. And this is a typical fauna in an Amazon rainforest. Immediately you have a hunter. This is what happens. So there is an elimination of many different species found in the area. And if you go further, this has an effect on the seed, the seed distributions within the forest, because as you eliminate seed dispersers, you're going to have a very clear effect on the actual functioning of the forest and the future of the forest itself. So this is, three different situations: non-hunted, half-empty forest, and empty forest. And you can see that seed shadows are severely affected by removing animals that are seed dispersers. These are a selection of seeds that are dispersed by animals in the Amazon rainforest. And this is what they are linked to. So all of these different species here are dispersers of these animals, of these forest trees, seeds. But immediately you eliminate, especially the large ones, the effect is up. So in no time at all you have a tremendous impact on the potential that these trees have, these species have, to actually disperse their seeds. And what you have in no time at all is a heavily wooded tree species extinct situation in which the large species of trees will disappear. Now, according to Carlos, if you eliminate atelines, spider monkeys, for example, you eliminate tapirs and spider monkeys, the effect on the Amazon areas, and we're talking Brazilian Amazon in particular, is that severe. All the red areas are going to be impacted through the removal of atelines and tapirs. And if you go further, according to Carlos, this is the amount of basically the value, the monetary value of dispersal-mediated carbon loss in overhunted areas in the Amazon Basin. So these are trillions of US dollars that we're going to lose if you continue with this situation. And the point that Carlos makes, actually, we keep talking about REDD and REDD+, and we're talking about ways of actually keeping the forest intact, but we don't talk too much about the loss of biodiversity and the impact of loss of biodiversity on the carbon stocks themselves. So I'm going to stop here, actually, so that we have 10 minutes for questions and answers. But essentially, we have a situation in which we know that there is a tremendous extraction of wild meat happening throughout the world. I can reiterate again that defaunation is perhaps a major an issue, a threat, much bigger, I think, than deforestation, because it's insidious. We don't actually see it until we have the empty forest. The concept of the empty forest, which Bradford came up with some years ago, is still very obvious and very latent, very apparent to all of us, and we must make sure that we do not. I was going to talk to you a little bit about policies and all that in order to stop overhunting, but we can leave that for the panel discussion. So I'm going to leave it there and open the floor to questions. Thank you.
So we take a few questions.
Thank you, John, for your wonderful presentation. My interest is in the impacts of bycatch, things that hunters don't really like, though they end up in their nets or snares. Could we be underestimating the impact of bushmeat hunting if we don't really know how much is left inside the forest and what is taken out of the forest?
That's a very good point, actually. You know that Andy Noss, the work that Andy did in Bayanga in the Congo shows very clearly the enormous amount of wastage that happens in snaring, because not all hunters are very good at actually locating their snares, and they're left there, and the animals are rot and all that. So I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to be better at. I don't want to sound that we should document everything, but I think we should be better at actually understanding the wastage issue. And I think, obviously, we should be better at actually working with the community so that wastage actually goes down and all that. But that's a very good point, actually. And it's going to happen. I think there is data as well coming out of Asia that shows that wastage is very, very great because of snaring and all that. So, good point. Yeah.
I think there was another question.
Yeah. Thank you for this really interesting talk. You mentioned that actually the traditional hunt is not a big issue compared to trade of the wild meat. But when they trade that, how important it is for protein consumption, or is it still something very traditional that even communities that are not living in the forest actually need this wild meat, but maybe for more traditional purposes?
Yes. Let me say one thing. I mean, I'm not saying that all traditional hunters are noble savages, that they know exactly, or ecological noble savages, like Michael Allard came up with. Obviously, there are situations in which rural communities, because there are too many hunters or whatever, you know, overhunt and overexploit an area around their settlements. The main problem that we are talking about now is that there is a tendency for hunters to sell a very large proportion often of the meat that they get to middlemen so that they can take it to big cities to be consumed more as a luxury. That, as you say, you know, people in cities don't really depend on wild meat as for their food security, but they want to eat it as a means of, you know, remembering the past or remembering the village or whatever. And that needs to change. And you know, we've done a lot of work now in Kinshasa and Brazzaville and some of the West African cities that show that you should come up with ways of changing people's attitudes towards wild meat. And what we do see in places like West African cities is that some of the young people don't want to eat bushmeat anymore. They say, well, that's something that my grandfather used to do. And I like a kebab or a burger. So things do change and are changing, but we need to stem the flow of wild meat from rural areas to cities, because what we're doing is depleting not just the faunas there, but also depriving people of food security.
And there was another question.
Thomas.
Yeah, hi John. And the first question related to this as well. There seems to be depressing similarities between fishing and bushmeat and wild meat trade. Are those two areas talking with each other, sharing best practice, trying to work on, or trying to not repeat the mistakes the others have made?
That's a good point. Yes, we are talking to each other, but although the principles seem to be more or less the same, the actual ecology of hunting and fishing are very different. What I mean to say is that if you look at the Pauly effect and that trophic downfall, it works very well in fishes because the large fish eats the smaller fish, and the smaller fish eats even smaller fish. In the case of hunting in Congo Basin, for example, we're not dealing with trophic gills, or we're not dealing with a relationship between animals in which necessarily one animal eats the other. We're dealing with something very different, but the effect is the same. In other words, we are losing large-bodied animals and being replaced. Somebody talked about McDonaldization. What we're having is the smaller, more productive animals taking over systems. And you saw that graph, that wonderful picture that Carlos has put together, that immediately you have hunters coming in. There is a decline in the size of animals that are found in there, but also the functionality sort of changes completely. And there is basically a release of resources for certain animals that weren't as abundant before. That system is happening. What I'm trying to say, Thomas, is that there are similarities. We can learn, we have learned a lot from fisheries. The situations are slightly different, but we need to do more work to understand what's happening. Yeah.
Thank you, John. I think Professor Hofer has a question.
John, before the indigenous people have always been there, at least from our point of view.
The indigenous people.
The indigenous people.
Yeah.
As I understand it, particularly in the Congo,
yeah.
the large-scale options to remove wood, which started in the 1980s,
yeah.
Led to the roads being put into the forest for the very first time.
Yes.
And the people who removed the trees discovered that they could also hunt. And as there was an avenue open to kind of non-traditional hunters and non-traditional ways of making use of the hunt that wasn't there before. It's not clear to me to understand that kind of ruthless exploitation that's only started in the 80s with these operations is included in your and your colleagues' figures of productivity, offtake and so on. Could you comment on that?
Well, when we have done extrapolations, we produce a paper looking at what will happen in 50 years' time if you continue at the rate of extraction that you do, that you had at the time the paper was written. And what we show very clearly is that, obviously, if we carry on without changing the way that we do exploitation, the whole thing is going to come down. But we took into account population increase, and we took into account deforestation rates. Okay, what we haven't done, and that would be something very interesting to do, is what is the fragmentation process that are occurring because of roads, etc. How is that really impacting exploitation? And with Stefan, we did that little study sort of looking at how much of the area in the Congo Basin has been exploited. Roads are incredibly important, but we need to do more work like that, and we need to find out. Now, if you are saying what's happened since the 1980s is that there's been a flurry of logging concessions everywhere. If you look at the map of logging concessions for Cameroon, for example, or Gabon, most of the countries are taken over by these. Okay. And we know that logging concessions, I'm going on to another topic here, but logging concessions have been, to some extent, promoters of the extraction of wild meat from the forest, for two reasons. Because logging concessions have employee populations that live in the concessions that need to be fed, and they go into the forest, and also because trucks are used as a way of taking animals out of the forest. So I think, you know, if I come back to your point, logging and you know, the influence of opening up the Congo Basin and of cutting up these forest blocks into smaller fragments must be understood far better than we have done at the moment. Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one last question.
Hello. Should I ask? Thank you. Thanks for the nice talk. I was wondering if you are aware of effective interventions against snaring in some study areas or protected areas.
Can you repeat, please? I can't hear very well.
Are there some example of successful interventions against snaring in some protected areas?
Against snaring, there are a number. I would ask Thomas Brewer to tell us more about his experiences where he worked in the Congo. There are, you know, there's work going on. I'm not trying to evade your question, but I'd like to be able to come up with a good example where, you know, working with communities, reducing snares has been successful. Unfortunately, there aren't 100% success stories for me to tell you. We work with Baka communities in the south of Cameroon, and one of the things that we're doing is actually trying to work with them so that they can come up with a sustainable formula for not overdoing the hunting that they do in these areas. And that means, in some areas, to reduce the number of snares that they put out. And maybe, you know, it is a very controversial topic because it's very difficult to stop snaring, because snaring is a very practical and easy way of obtaining food. So, Thomas, help us later on. I'm sure you have good examples, but we are working towards that.
So, thank you very much. Thanks, John. I mean, I think plenty of things to discuss, but luckily we have a bit of more of John Farr this afternoon. There's a panel discussion, and we start at 2:15 in this lecture hall here. So please join us. I mean, there will be more time certainly to ask questions. There will be representatives from the German government. There will be representatives from the German Financial Corporation. So once again, thanks a lot, John, for the. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you see the next slide is already up there, getting the big picture, landscape scale surveys. And welcome Nicholas Krüger from the IZW in Berlin, and he takes us to Southeast Asia. Thank you, please come on.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for that very fascinating plenary talk. I'll be speaking today about getting the big picture, assessing defaunation at landscape scales, and how that can be used to target conservation interventions. So, as John already mentioned in his talk, defaunation, simply put, is the loss of larger vertebrate species from an ecosystem. And there are several ways that this can happen, several anthropogenic pressures. Hunting is the one that most people think about. But we also have habitat loss and habitat degradation, fragmentation as well. And I think it's very important, in my opinion, to understand that these processes play out over very large spatial scales. A single hunter taking a single animal or a logger cutting down a single tree may not make much difference, but cumulatively these can have enormous impacts over large areas of tropical rainforest. So because of that, I think it's important to consider to assess defaunation at landscape scales so that we can come up with effective conservation solutions also at these scales. And in this talk, I'm going to be touching on two aspects of work that my colleagues and I have been working on the past few years. The first is assessing how different drivers of defaunation impact faunal communities in Southeast Asia. And then secondly, identifying areas of high biodiversity within an already heavily defaunated landscape in Vietnam and Laos with the goal of targeting conservation interventions. So the project that I was working on with my PhD under Dr. Andreas Wilting had two study sites. The first was in the Annamites mountain range in Vietnam and Laos, and the second was in the Malaysian state of Sabah on the island of Borneo. And these two study sites are remarkably similar in many ways. They have similar faunal compositions. They're both composed of broadleaf evergreen tropical rainforests, but they're very different in the anthropogenic threats that they face. In Vietnam and Laos, the primary threat is massive unsustainable hunting, which is accomplished almost exclusively by the setting of wire snares. And in Sabah, Borneo, the primary defaunation driver is habitat degradation through logging. So similar situations in terms of ecology, but very different threats. This is the study design that we used. It was the same study design in both of our sites. We used systematic camera trapping design with camera traps spaced every 2.5 kilometers across very large areas, entire protected areas. In Vietnam and Laos, we surveyed 3 areas in Vietnam, 3 protected areas, 1 part of a protected area in Laos, and 1 unprotected forest block to the south. That will be important for later. And in the state of Sabah in Borneo, we surveyed 3 current or former logging concessions with different levels of forest degradation. There was one site, Daramakat, that was an FSC certified site with minimal forest degradation, and then Tenggelap with higher levels of degradation, and finally Northern Kua, which had pretty extensive forest degradation. And so one of the questions we wanted to ask was, how do these different types of anthropogenic pressures, impact the faunal communities in both of these sites? How do they affect defaunation? And so first we had to come up with a way of quantifying defaunation, and luckily I stumbled across this really excellent paper by Giacomini and Galetti, which proposed a way of doing exactly that. There's no need to get bogged down in the nitty-gritty components of that equation. Just big picture, this defaunation index compares a intact community, a less defaunated community, with a more defaunated community. And it gives a value of between 0 and 1, where 0 indicates almost no difference between the two and very little defaunation, and 1 indicates complete difference and therefore complete defaunation. And this equation also allows you to weight species by different levels of importance if you choose to do that. For our study, we compared the historical community that should exist in each of our study sites in both Vietnam and Laos, and then in Malaysia and Borneo, with the mammal and bird community that we actually detected in our work. And we used 3 different species weights. We used equal with no weight. We used body mass, so we scaled species by how large they were. And then we used a measure of conservation status from the IUCN Red List assessment. And when we do this, we find that under the equal weighting scenario, the hunted landscapes, the hunted sites in Vietnam and Laos had much higher levels of defaunation than our degraded sites in Malaysia and Borneo. And what's even more interesting, I think, is that when we scaled species or weighted species by conservation importance and body size, the defaunation index values go up considerably for our hunted sites in Vietnam and Laos, but remain more or less constant and very low for the degraded sites in Sabah, which seems to indicate that conservation priority species and larger species are disproportionately lost from the system when there is intensive, unsustainable hunting, but not so much with forest degradation. We wanted to dig a little bit further into this. Instead of looking at species presence absence, we wanted to use some fancy, fun occupancy models. So we actually chose a list of species or sister species that occur in both sites, in both Vietnam and Laos, and then also in Malaysia and Borneo. And we used occupancy models to get occupancy estimates for that suite of similar species, under the assumption that there might be individual differences because of differences in ecology, but the occupancies for the entire suite of similar species should be more or less similar. And when we did that, we found that for most species, 9 of the 15 species pairs, occupancies were much higher in the degraded sites and much lower in the hunted sites, which seems to indicate that defaunation through unsustainable hunting not only affects species presence-absence, but it also impacts species distribution as well. And what's interesting, I'll just quickly note that the species, many of the species that have similar occupancies are species that are known to be highly adaptable to intense levels of anthropogenic pressures, like crab-eating mongoose, leopard cat. These are species that are the mammalian equivalents of cockroaches. They are incredibly resilient to intense levels of anthropogenic pressures. So the main points from this part of the work that we did is that unsustainable hunting may, in some cases, be a more severe short-term threat to some tropical faunal communities than moderate levels of habitat degradation, and that larger and more threatened species appear to be more susceptible to hunting-driven defaunation and that has potentially severe effects for our implications of ecosystem cascades. That's a topic that needs to be investigated further. The second part of my talk that I'll quickly touch on is that we also did some spatially explicit modeling to try to identify patterns of defaunation in our heavily defaunated sites in Vietnam and Laos. As I mentioned earlier, these sites are in the Annamites ecoregion, where hunting through unsustainable snaring is a huge problem. The level of snaring in these landscapes is really difficult to comprehend. I think some of the highest, most severe in any tropical forest on the planet. And this has caused, not surprisingly, population crashes for a wide range of terrestrial vertebrates. Now that's a particular problem for this area because this area has such a high concentration of endemic species. These are forest mammal species that are only found in this ecoregion, nowhere else, and they are all basically on the brink of extinction. Saola is quite probably already gone. So we have a situation where there are many endemic species that are all highly threatened, and the snaring levels are not going to go down anytime soon, so we need to try to enact effective conservation measures to protect these species. The primary conservation response in the areas in which we're working, in central Vietnam and in Laos, is snare removal, but these snare removal teams are not directed to any particular area based on biodiversity indicators. So we actually wanted to map patterns of biodiversity in this area to try to provide information for targeted snare removal teams so that they could basically go to areas where we think these high priority endemic species might still occur. And so this is what we did. I already showed this earlier, but this was our sampling scheme across 3 protected areas in Vietnam, a protected area in Laos, and an unprotected area to the south of Dây Sáp National Protected Area. We used camera trapping, and what I didn't mention earlier is that we also collected leeches around each of our camera traps and identified genotyped the blood inside the leeches to try to get additional biodiversity data. Cool stuff. We detected 23 mammal species altogether from our leeches and our camera traps, including some endemic species like Annamite striped rabbit and the Annamite dark muntjac. And we used these data in conjunction with Bayesian multi-species occupancy models. And the covariates that we used for our modeling approach were 3 anthropogenic covariates that we believed might influence hunting pressure, including distance from major cities, because major cities are sources of bushmeat trade, village density, because villagers often hunt around in these protected areas. We also use a least cost path function for major roads that we calculated across 3 different time periods to try to get at the amount of time that an area might have been under hunting pressure. And we also included elevation as a covariate in our analyses, which impacts a wide range of habitat-related microhabitat issues, as well as it is an indication of how difficult it is to reach an area, because higher elevation areas are more difficult to reach. So we put these data, combine these, our animal detections, with our 4 covariates, and with the species responses, produce some species richness maps across our areas. And I don't want to go too into detail here, but I just want to note 2 things. First, the species richness is very low across all of our sites. We had an average species richness of 7 animals which for a tropical rainforest is very low, especially considering that there should be more than 30 mammal species in this tropical rainforest. There are a few areas. This top figure is total species richness, and this bottom figure is species richness for threatened and endemic species. And what stands out when we map this spatially is that this unprotected area to the south appears to be really a hot spot, especially for the threatened and endemic species. And there are a few isolated high elevation areas that might also have higher concentrations of these species in Vietnam. We also repeated this with the 3 endemic species to try to map out where they're more likely to occur in the landscape, and we see a similar pattern. These are maps of occupancy. Occupancies are very low across all sites, but do appear to be higher in this unprotected forest block to the south, and in a few high elevations, more remote areas along the border of the 2 reserves. So hopefully we can use this information to try to target our anti-poaching patrols and remove snares from these areas. So that's what we hope this information will be useful for. And we'd also like to use this information to try to support the gazettement of this unprotected forest block as an official protected area, because it obviously appears to be the best area in this already heavily defaulted landscape. And I'd like to thank these organizations, and I'm not sure if we have questions, but I'm happy to take some if we have time.
We have time for maximum 2 questions. So 1 or 2 questions?
Andrew, excellent. Do you have information on numbers of snares removed? Do you have maps of that? And the other question is, you using accent?
Yeah, excellent questions. I just didn't touch on this because I didn't have time. But there are snare removal teams operational in these 2 areas, and between 2011 and 2017, they removed 110,000 wire snares. But that is a drop in the bucket compared to what's actually in the forest. I mean, we don't know how many snares are in the forest, but given the incomplete detection rates of snares in dense tropical rainforest, I'd expect it to be many times that number. And no, we didn't use Maxent, we used occupancy models so that we accounted for species incomplete detection rates.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Andrew Zeger will be in our discussion panel this afternoon as well, so we have him there as well. Thanks. The last presentation before we sort of go into our topic. Now the next presentation takes us back to Central Africa.